Miss Marple and the House of Silent Clues.
Chapter 1. An Invitation to Meadowcroft. The summer afternoon was unusually warm in St. Mary Mead. The roses in Miss Marple's garden glowed pink and red beneath the sunlight, while bees drifted lazily from flower to flower. Jane Marple sat comfortably in a wicker chair near her window, her knitting needles moving steadily as she worked on a blue woolen scarf. Life in the village was peaceful, and Miss Marple had long learned to appreciate the small routines of each day. To many people, she appeared to be an elderly lady occupied with gardening, knitting, and village gossip. Few suspected that behind her gentle blue eyes was one of the sharpest minds in England. A knock came at the front door. Her maid, Florence, entered a moment later carrying a silver tray. "A letter for you, Miss Marple." "Thank you, Florence." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and picked up the envelope. The handwriting immediately brought a smile to her face. "It is from Raymond." Raymond West, her nephew, was a successful writer, known for his imaginative stories and dramatic opinions. He was intelligent, charming, and often convinced that he understood human nature far better than he actually did. Miss Marple opened the letter and began reading. "My dear Aunt Jane, I hope you are keeping well. I have recently rented a beautiful country house called Meadowcroft in the village of Ashcombe. It is exactly the sort of place one imagines while reading old English novels. Rolling hills, quiet lanes, ancient cottages, and interesting people. I would be delighted if you came to stay with me for a few weeks. The fresh air will do you good, and I confess I could use your company. The villagers are fascinating characters, and I suspect you would enjoy observing them. Your affectionate nephew, Raymond." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "Well," she murmured, "that sounds pleasant." She had always enjoyed visiting new villages. Human nature, she often reflected, was remarkably similar everywhere, yet each community possessed its own peculiar character. By evening, she had decided to accept the invitation. 2 days later, she boarded a train bound for Ashcombe. The journey was delightful. The countryside passed by in a patchwork of green fields, grazing sheep, and distant church spires. Miss Marple spent much of the trip quietly observing her fellow passengers. There was a businessman who pretended to read a newspaper but actually watched everyone around him. A young couple argued softly about money. A schoolboy secretly fed crumbs to birds whenever the conductor wasn't looking. Human nature, she thought, never changed. When the train finally arrived at Ashcombe Station, Raymond was waiting on the platform. "Aunt Jane?" He hurried forward and kissed her cheek. "Raymond, dear, you look exactly the same, and you look exactly as untidy as ever." Raymond laughed. "Come along. I've borrowed a motor car." As they drove through the village, Miss Marple studied her surroundings. Ashcombe was charming. Narrow roads wound between ancient stone cottages covered with ivy. Flower boxes brightened windowsills. A small stream flowed through the center of the village, crossed by a graceful stone bridge. The church tower stood on a hill overlooking everything. "It is lovely," Miss Marple admitted. "I told you." They continued along a tree-lined lane until Meadowcroft appeared. The house was large but welcoming, built from pale stone and surrounded by gardens. Tall oak trees shaded the front lawn. "It's beautiful," said Miss Marple. "Wait until you see the view from your room." Inside, the house was comfortable rather than grand. Books filled every shelf. Papers and manuscripts covered several tables. "You've been working hard," Miss Marple observed, "or avoiding work very creatively." That evening, Raymond showed her around the property. As they walked through the garden, he pointed toward a neighboring estate separated by a hedge and a narrow path. "That house belongs to Edgar Whitmore." Miss Marple looked across. The neighboring residence was larger and older than Meadowcroft. Its windows reflected the evening sunlight. "Who is he?" she asked. "A retired watchmaker, extremely wealthy. A watchmaker, one of the finest in England, apparently, built luxury clocks and watches for collectors. Retired years ago." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "What sort of man is he?" "Reserved, intelligent, not particularly friendly. Those qualities often occur together." Raymond laughed. "You'll meet him soon enough." The following afternoon, Raymond hosted a small gathering. Several villagers arrived, and Miss Marple was introduced to them one by one. First came Clara Whitmore, Edgar's niece. She was a young woman with dark hair and thoughtful eyes. She spoke politely, but seemed slightly nervous. Then came Dr. Stephen Hale. Tall and confident, the doctor possessed the calm manner of someone accustomed to handling emergencies. Reverend Thomas Reed arrived shortly afterward. The village clergyman was a respected man in his late 50s. His voice was gentle, and everyone appeared to like him. Peter Lang, a local artist, followed. He wore paint-stained clothing and carried a sketchbook wherever he went. Finally, there was Oliver Briggs, a businessman with sharp features and careful manners. Mr. Briggs was once Mr. Whitmore's business partner, Raymond explained. Miss Marple noticed the brief glance exchanged between Briggs and Clara Whitmore. Interesting, she thought. The gathering proceeded pleasantly. Tea was served on the lawn. Conversations drifted from local history to politics to gardening. Miss Marple mostly listened. Listening, she had found, was far more useful than talking. At one point, Edgar Whitmore himself appeared. He was a tall man in his 70s with silver hair and penetrating grey eyes. Although polite, he seemed distracted. "Miss Marple," he said, shaking her hand. "I understand you are visiting from St. Mary Mead." "Yes. I hope Ashcombe proves entertaining. Villages usually are." For the briefest moment, a faint smile crossed his face. "Indeed they are." Yet Miss Marple sensed something beneath his calm exterior. A tension, a hidden concern. Several times during the afternoon she noticed him studying the other guests, especially Oliver Briggs. The observation lasted only seconds each time, but it was enough. Years of experience had taught Miss Marple to recognize uneasiness. As the gathering ended and the guests departed, she sat with Raymond on the terrace overlooking the fading evening light. "You seem thoughtful, Aunt Jane." "Do I?" "You've noticed something." Miss Marple smiled. "Only that your neighbours appear rather interesting." "Interesting how?" "Oh, in the ordinary way." Raymond groaned. "Whenever you say ordinary way, something extraordinary usually follows." "Nonsense." But even as she spoke, Miss Marple glanced once more toward Edgar Whitmore's house. One upstairs window glowed in the twilight. For a moment, she saw a shadow move across the curtain. Then it vanished. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing appeared threatening. Yet Miss Marple felt a faint sense of unease she could not explain. In her long life, she had learned to trust such feelings. Often they arrived before reason, before evidence, before events themselves. As darkness settled over Ashcombe and the village lights began to appear one by one, Miss Marple retired to bed. She could not know that within a few days the peaceful village would be shaken by murder. Nor could she imagine that the people she had met that afternoon would soon become suspects in a mystery that would test every ounce of her intelligence. For now, however, Ashcombe slept peacefully beneath the 8 stars, and the first moves in a deadly game had already begun. The crime scene contained several peculiar clues. Clues? Yes. He removed a notebook. First, Mr. Whitmore's pocket watch had stopped at exactly 8:17. Miss Marple listened attentively. Second, there was a wet umbrella beside his desk. "A wet umbrella?" Raymond repeated. "There was no rain." "Exactly," the inspector continued. "A burned sheet of music was found in the fireplace." "Could Whitmore read music?" asked Miss Marple. "No." "Interesting." Stone nodded. There was also a white feather on the floor, a missing chess piece from a nearby chessboard, an upside-down painting on the wall, and an untouched cup of tea containing traces of sleeping medicine. Raymond stared. "Good heavens." "Quite." Inspector Stone closed the notebook. "Either these clues mean something, or someone wants us to think they do." After he departed, silence settled over the room. Chapter 2. The Murder Next Door. The morning after the gathering dawned bright and clear. Miss Marple spent several peaceful days at Meadowcroft. She enjoyed walks through the village, conversations with local residents, and long afternoons in the garden with her knitting. Ashcombe appeared to be exactly what it claimed, a quiet English village untouched by the troubles of the modern world. Yet beneath the calm surface, tensions existed. Miss Marple noticed them gradually. One afternoon she observed Oliver Briggs leaving Edgar Whitmore's house, looking unusually angry. The following day Clara Whitmore arrived for a visit, but departed after only 10 minutes. Her eyes red as though she had been crying. Even Reverend Thomas Reed, always cheerful in public, seemed distracted whenever Edgar Whitmore's name was mentioned. These small details settled quietly in Miss Marple's mind. On Thursday evening, Raymond hosted a modest dinner. The guests included Dr. Stephen Hale and Peter Lang. Conversation flowed pleasantly enough. Peter spoke enthusiastically about a landscape he was painting. Dr. Hale described a difficult medical case. Raymond argued passionately about modern literature. Miss Marple listened with amusement. At around 9 o'clock, she happened to glance through the dining room window toward Edgar Whitmore's house. A light was visible in the study. The room overlooked the garden and was easily recognizable. Someone was moving inside. She thought little of it at the time. After dinner, the guests departed. The village settled into silence. A pale moon hung above the hills. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, shortly after midnight, a scream shattered the night. Miss Marple sat upright in bed. The sound had come from nearby, a woman's voice, terrified. A moment later, she heard hurried footsteps outside, doors opening, voices shouting. Another scream. Miss Marple quickly dressed and descended the stairs. She found Raymond already in the hallway pulling on a coat. "You heard it?" "Yes," said Miss Marple calmly. "It came from Whitmore's house." Together they hurried outside. Lights were appearing throughout the village. People emerged from cottages carrying lanterns and flashlights. The path leading to Edgar Whitmore's residence was crowded with anxious villagers. As Miss Marple approached the front entrance, she recognized Mrs. Finch, Edgar's housekeeper. The elderly woman was trembling violently. "What happened?" Raymond asked. Mrs. Finch struggled to speak. "Mr. Whitmore, in the study. Is he hurt?" She shook her head, then whispered the terrible words. "He's dead." A heavy silence fell. Several villagers gasped. Dr. Hale immediately pushed forward. "Take me to him." Mrs. Finch led them inside. The atmosphere within the house felt strangely cold. Miss Marple remained near the doorway while Dr. Hale entered the study. A few moments later he emerged. His expression confirmed the truth. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Mr. Whitmore is dead." The room erupted into shocked whispers. "How? Was it an accident? What happened?" Dr. Hale hesitated, then spoke. "No." Everyone stared at him. "No," he repeated. "This was murder." The word seemed to echo through the hall. Murder. In Ashcombe, the peaceful village suddenly felt very different. Police arrived from the nearby town shortly afterward. The investigation was placed under the authority of Inspector Gerald Stone. He was a solidly built man in his 40s, with sharp eyes and a practical manner. After speaking briefly with witnesses, he entered the study. No one else was permitted inside, not even Miss Marple. Yet over the next hour, details began to emerge. Edgar Whitmore had been discovered lying beside his desk. A large bronze clock rested near the body. There was a severe wound to the back of his head. The clock appeared to have been used as a weapon. More puzzling still, the study door had been locked from the inside. The only key was found on Edgar's desk. The windows were closed and secured. There appeared to be no way for a killer to escape. "A locked room murder," Raymond muttered. Inspector Stone did not look pleased. Locked room mysteries rarely made a policeman's life easier. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the villagers were finally sent home. Miss Marple and Raymond walked back to Meadowcroft beneath a sky beginning to brighten with dawn. "Extraordinary," Raymond said. "Terrible," corrected Miss Marple. "Do you have any ideas?" "My dear Raymond, a man has just died. It is far too early for ideas." Yet she was already thinking. The next morning, the village awoke to chaos. News spread rapidly. Groups gathered outside shops discussing the murder. Rumors multiplied by the hour. By midday, Inspector Stone had begun formal interviews. Miss Marple sat in the garden while villagers passed by sharing information. Most of it was useless. Some of it was interesting. Late that afternoon, Raymond returned from the village looking excited. "The police have identified several suspects." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Already?" "Apparently Mr. Whitmore wasn't as universally admired as people believed. Few wealthy men are." Raymond sat down. "First, there's Clara Whitmore." "His niece?" "Yes, she inherits nearly everything." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Money is always a useful motive." "Second is Oliver Briggs, the former business partner." "Exactly. Several people heard them arguing recently." Miss Marple remembered the tense glance between the two men. "Who else?" "Peter Lang owed Whitmore a substantial amount of money." "Interesting. And Dr. Hale visited the house on the evening of the murder. Miss Marple considered this carefully. A doctor visiting a patient is hardly unusual. No, but apparently he was one of the last people known to have seen Whitmore alive. That evening Inspector Stone visited Meadowcroft. Raymond greeted him warmly. The inspector accepted tea and spoke candidly. The case is unusual. So I've heard, said Miss Marple. Stone smiled politely. He knew who she was. Most police officers familiar with famous investigations had heard stories about Miss Marple. We've discovered something strange, he said. What sort of thing? Raymond asked. Raymond looked fascinated. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. 7 clues, each strange, each seemingly unrelated. The stopped watch, the wet umbrella, the burned music sheet, the feather, the missing chess piece, the upside-down painting, the tea containing medicine. Too many clues. Far too many. Most murderers tried to conceal evidence. This killer appeared to have left an entire collection of mysteries behind. Miss Marple moved to the window. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the gardens. Beyond the hedge, Edgar Whitmore's house stood dark and silent. Its owner was gone. Its secrets remained. And somewhere in Ashcombe, a murderer was waiting to see whether the carefully arranged clues would deceive the police. Miss Marple gazed toward the neighbouring house. Her instincts told her that the real mystery was not hidden within the clues. It was hidden behind them. And before this investigation ended, every person she had met during that pleasant afternoon gathering would come under suspicion. The game had begun. Chapter 3. The 7 Strange Clues. The morning after Inspector Stone revealed the strange evidence, Ashcombe awoke beneath a sky heavy with grey clouds. The murder of Edgar Whitmore dominated every conversation. Groups gathered outside the bakery, the post office, and the village shop. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a suspect, yet nobody possessed answers. Miss Marple spent much of the morning knitting by the drawing-room window at Meadowcroft. To Raymond, it appeared that she was peacefully occupied with wool and needles. In reality, she was thinking. A murder was one puzzle. A murder accompanied by 7 unusual clues was something else entirely. By noon, Inspector Stone arrived with unexpected news. "I've obtained permission for you to view the study, Miss Marple." Raymond nearly spilled his tea. "You have?" The inspector smiled faintly. "I know your reputation." Miss Marple rose. "That is very kind." Half an hour later, they entered Edgar Whitmore's house. The atmosphere remained oppressive. Servants moved quietly through the corridors. Mrs. Finch looked exhausted. The study itself was exactly as Miss Marple had imagined. Large bookshelves lined the walls. A massive desk stood near the centre of the room. Tall windows overlooked the garden. The room felt orderly, almost too orderly. Inspector Stone gestured toward the desk. "This is where the body was found." Miss Marple nodded. The carpet had been cleaned, but the position remained marked in her mind. She began examining the room carefully, not searching, observing. There was a difference. The first clue lay on the desk, a gold pocket watch. Inspector Stone opened it. The watch stopped at exactly 8:17. Miss Marple examined it closely. The hands remained frozen. Was the mechanism damaged? No. Then why did it stop? That's what we'd like to know. Miss Marple returned the watch. Most people immediately assumed the time indicated the murder. She wasn't convinced. Clocks and watches often lied. People used them to create false impressions. The second clue stood nearby. A black umbrella. Inspector Stone picked it up. It was wet when discovered. But there was no rain. Not a drop. Miss Marple touched the handle. Curious. A wet umbrella suggested someone arriving from outside. Yet if there had been no rain, why would anyone carry one? Unless, of course, somebody wanted investigators to ask exactly that question. She said nothing. The third clue rested in the fireplace. Inspector Stone handed her a small evidence envelope. Inside were fragments of burned sheet music. The victim had no interest in music, he explained. Can the title be identified? Only a few notes survived. Miss Marple studied the charred fragments. Music, another seemingly unrelated mystery. She placed the envelope back on the desk. The fourth clue was perhaps the strangest. A single white feather. The inspector pointed toward the exact location where it had been found. There. Miss Marple looked down. A bird feather. Yes. Any poultry nearby? No. Any decorative cushions? No. The feather had no obvious explanation, which made it dangerous. People often became fascinated by unusual clues while ignoring important facts. The fifth clue involved the chessboard. A beautiful wooden set stood upon a small side table. The pieces remained arranged mid-game. Inspector Stone indicated an empty square. One white knight is missing. Miss Marple leaned closer. Only the knight. Only the knight. The piece had never been found. Someone had removed it. Why? A message? A symbol? Or another distraction? The sixth clue hung on the wall. An oil painting depicting a countryside landscape. At first glance it seemed ordinary. Then Miss Marple noticed it was upside down. The sky occupied the bottom. The fields floated above. It was discovered like this, she asked. Yes. Who normally arranged the room? The housekeeper. And she insists it was hanging correctly before the murder. Miss Marple studied the frame. Someone had deliberately reversed it. Again the question emerged. Why? Finally came the seventh clue. The teacup. It still rested on a tray near the desk. Laboratory analysis had already been completed. There were traces of sleeping medicine in the tea, said Inspector Stone. But the tea wasn't consumed. Correct. And Mr. Whitmore died from a blow to the head. Exactly. Miss Marple sat quietly. 7 clues, 7 questions, 7 mysteries. Yet something felt wrong. Most crimes generated 1 mystery, perhaps 2. This crime produced 7. That troubled her. Very much. As she continued examining the room, another detail caught her attention. Nothing had been stolen. Edgar Whitmore possessed valuable watches, rare books, and expensive antiques. All remained untouched. The murder had not been committed for theft. That much seemed certain. Inspector Stone joined her near the window. What do you think? Miss Marple smiled gently. I think somebody worked very hard after the murder. The inspector raised an eyebrow. After? Perhaps. Meaning? I haven't decided yet. Stone looked disappointed. Policemen preferred clear answers. Miss Marple preferred correct ones. Later that afternoon she began speaking with villagers. Not formally, casually. She first visited the bakery. Within minutes she learned that Edgar Whitmore and Oliver Briggs had argued several times during the previous month. The reason remained unclear. At the post office she discovered another fact. Clara Whitmore had recently received several letters from her uncle. The contents were unknown. Then she encountered Peter Lang near the village green. The artist appeared nervous. Terrible business, he said. Very terrible. You knew Mr. Whitmore well, reasonably well. Did he play chess? Peter blinked. Chess? Yes. He loved it. Interesting. That explained the chessboard, but not the missing knight. As evening approached, Miss Marple walked home through the churchyard. The ancient stones glowed beneath the setting sun. Near the entrance, she encountered Reverend Thomas Reed. The clergyman looked tired. Murder affects a community deeply, he said sadly. It certainly does. I keep thinking of poor Edgar. Miss Marple watched him carefully. The Reverend's grief appeared genuine, yet something about him seemed strained, as though he carried a burden. Perhaps it was only shock, perhaps not. That night, Raymond found Miss Marple sitting before the fire. You've been thinking. A little. Have you solved it? Miss Marple laughed softly. My dear Raymond, real life is not one of your novels. Then what have you discovered? She placed her knitting aside. I've discovered that the clues are too numerous. Too numerous? Yes. Raymond frowned. I don't understand. A murderer usually wishes to hide the truth. Naturally. But someone in this case appears determined to create mysteries. The 7 clues. Exactly. She stared into the flames. The watch points one way, the umbrella another, the music sheet another, the feather another, the chess piece another, the painting another, the tea another. Raymond nodded slowly. They all suggest different explanations, which is precisely the problem. The room fell silent. Outside, darkness settled across Ashcombe. Somewhere nearby a church bell rang. Miss Marple listened thoughtfully. The 7 clues seemed unrelated, yet she suspected they possessed one thing in common. Not their meaning, their purpose. Someone had carefully placed them. Someone wanted investigators chasing false trails. And if that were true, the clues themselves might reveal less about the victim than about the murderer. For the first time since the investigation began, Miss Marple felt she was approaching the heart of the mystery. The clues were not the answer. They were the disguise hiding the answer. And sooner or later, the person who created that disguise would make a mistake. Chapter 4. The False Trails. The rain began shortly after dawn. Grey clouds hung low over Ashcombe, and a steady drizzle transformed the village lanes into ribbons of mud. The gloomy weather seemed appropriate. Ever since Edgar Whitmore's murder, an atmosphere of unease had settled over the community. Doors closed earlier. Conversations stopped when strangers approached. People glanced nervously over their shoulders. The murder had become more than a crime. It had become a shadow hanging over the village. Miss Marple sat by the window at Meadowcroft, knitting quietly while watching the rain slide down the glass. Across the room, Raymond paced restlessly. "I don't understand it," he said. "You don't understand many things, dear. I mean the clues. So do I. The watch, the umbrella, the feather. They must mean something." Miss Marple smiled. "Everything means something, Raymond. The difficulty is deciding what." A knock interrupted them. Inspector Stone entered moments later, carrying a folder filled with papers. His expression suggested a long and frustrating morning. "I've completed several interviews," he announced. "And?" asked Raymond eagerly. "And every suspect appears guilty for approximately 10 minutes. Miss Marple nodded. "Then they are probably innocent." The inspector laughed. "That is beginning to be my opinion." He sat down and opened the folder. "Let's begin with Clara Whitmore." Miss Marple listened carefully. She inherited nearly all of her uncle's estate. "A strong motive," said Raymond. "Very strong." The inspector removed several documents. "We also confirmed that the sleeping medicine found in the tea belonged to her prescription." Raymond leaned forward. "That sounds serious." "It did. What changed?" Inspector Stone sighed. "Her alibi." He explained that Clara had visited Edgar on the afternoon before the murder. Several witnesses had seen her leave shortly before sunset. Afterward, she attended a charity concert in a neighboring village. More than 50 people had seen her there. The timeline was impossible. "She could not have been present when Whitmore died," said Stone. "Unless she hired someone," Raymond suggested. "Possible," admitted the inspector. "But there is no evidence." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. What was the purpose of her visit? Stone glanced at his notes. They argued. About money? No. Then what? Whitmore wanted her to postpone her engagement. Miss Marple looked up. Engagement? To Oliver Briggs. For a moment, nobody spoke. The revelation changed everything. "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Very," agreed the inspector. "Did Whitmore disapprove of Briggs?" "Strongly." The inspector closed the file. "Which brings us to suspect number 2, Oliver Briggs." Rain tapped against the windows as Stone continued. "Several witnesses heard Briggs arguing with Whitmore during the previous month." "About business?" asked Raymond. "Apparently." The inspector produced accounting records. "Their partnership ended years ago, but financial disagreements remained." "That sounds promising," Raymond said. "It did." Again, the inspector looked frustrated. "What went wrong?" asked Miss Marple. "Evidence." Stone explained that the financial dispute had actually been settled nearly 2 weeks before the murder. Whitmore himself had signed the agreement. Furthermore, Oliver Briggs had spent the evening of the crime attending a business dinner in a nearby town. 8 people confirmed his presence. "He left briefly around 8:30, said Stone, "but the journey to Ashcombe would have taken nearly 40 minutes, so he couldn't have done it." "Not unless he learned to fly," Raymond groaned. Another suspect eliminated. Miss Marple remained thoughtful. "What is your opinion of Mr. Briggs?" The inspector considered. "Ambitious. And cautious. Those qualities often go together." Stone nodded. "Yes." The conversation moved to Peter Lang. The artist had become the subject of considerable gossip. Everyone knew he owed money. Everyone knew Whitmore had financed several of his projects. Debt provided motive. At least in theory. The inspector opened another file. Peter Lang owed Whitmore nearly £2,000. "That is substantial," Raymond observed. "It certainly is." "Then why isn't he under arrest?" Stone smiled grimly. "Because he spent the evening painting in front of 30 witnesses." Peter had been participating in a public exhibition at the County Art Gallery. Visitors came and went throughout the night. Dozens remembered speaking with him. Photographs even placed him there. "He couldn't possibly have reached Ashcombe in time," said Stone. "Another dead end." Miss Marple nodded slowly. 3 suspects, 3 motives, 3 alibis. Too neat, far too neat. Who remains? She asked. Dr. Hale. The inspector's expression became more serious. Now there's an interesting case. Raymond leaned forward again. The doctor visited Whitmore that evening. Yes. Was Whitmore ill? Not seriously. Stone consulted his notes. Minor heart condition. Then Hale had access to the house. Correct. And sleeping medicine. Also correct. For the first time, a genuine possibility seemed to emerge. The room grew quiet. Then Stone shook his head. Unfortunately, Dr. Hale was delivering a baby. Raymond blinked. A baby? At a farm 7 miles away, the inspector smiled. The child chose an excellent night to arrive. Several people were present throughout the delivery. The doctor's movements could be accounted for almost minute by minute. Another perfect alibi. Another suspect removed from consideration. When Stone finished speaking, silence settled over the room. 4 suspects, 4 motives, 4 alibis. The investigation appeared to be moving backward rather than forward. Eventually, the inspector rose. I should return to the station. At the door, he paused. One more thing. Yes? Asked Miss Marple. We've confirmed that none of the suspects can be connected to all 7 clues. Meaning? The clues point in different directions. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Exactly. After the inspector departed, Raymond threw himself into a chair. This is impossible. No, it is. No mystery is impossible. Then explain it. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. I cannot explain it yet. But you have a theory. A small one. Raymond waited. She remained silent. Aunt Jane. Yes? You are being irritating. I know. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided to take a walk despite the rain. Armed with an umbrella, she followed a path toward the village church. The churchyard was empty. Only the sound of rainfall disturbed the silence. As she wandered among the ancient gravestones, she reflected upon the investigation. Every clue pointed somewhere different. The watch suggested false timing. The tea suggested poisoning. The feather suggested birds. The chess piece suggested strategy. The music sheet suggested musicians. The umbrella suggested weather. The painting suggested hidden meaning. Too many directions, too many possibilities. And then, quite suddenly, Miss Marple realized what troubled her most. The clues were competing with one another. A real crime scene usually told a single story. This one told 7. That could not be natural. Near the church gate, she encountered Reverend Thomas Reed. The clergyman looked tired. Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Good afternoon, Reverend. The rain seems determined to continue. Nature rarely consults our preferences. The Reverend smiled politely. Yet once again Miss Marple sensed tension beneath the surface. He appeared worried, distracted, almost fearful. Have the police made progress? He asked. A little. I hope they find the guilty person soon. So do I. Their conversation ended shortly afterward. As Miss Marple walked home, she found herself thinking about the Reverend. Not because she suspected him, not yet, but because his anxiety seemed greater than everyone else's. Most villagers feared a murderer. Reed appeared afraid of something more specific. That evening she sat alone in the drawing room. The fire crackled softly. Outside, rain continued falling. Her knitting rested untouched in her lap. Slowly, carefully, she arranged the facts in her mind. The murderer had not hidden evidence. The murderer had created evidence. That distinction mattered enormously. Someone wanted the police chasing false explanations. Someone intelligent. Someone patient. Someone who understood how investigators think. Miss Marple gazed into the flames. The obvious suspects were innocent. The obvious clues were false, which meant the solution lay elsewhere, somewhere hidden behind the carefully constructed confusion. And sooner or later, the person responsible would reveal themselves. Because no matter how clever a deception might be, human nature always left traces. And human nature, Miss Marple knew better than anyone, could never remain hidden forever. Chapter 5. Miss Marple notices the impossible. The following morning dawned clear and bright after 3 days of rain. Sunlight poured across the gardens of Meadowcroft, sparkling on leaves still wet from the storm. The village appeared peaceful once again, but beneath the calm surface the tension remained. The murderer was still free. Miss Marple sat on the terrace with her knitting. A cup of tea rested beside her, untouched. She was thinking, not about the clues themselves, about the person who had created them. That distinction had become increasingly important. Raymond emerged from the house carrying a newspaper. "More reports about the murder," he said. "How tiresome. You don't seem interested." "I am interested in facts, Raymond. Newspapers prefer excitement." He sat beside her. "The village believes Oliver Briggs did it. Yesterday they believed Clara did it. True. And before that they suspected Peter Lang." Raymond laughed. "Everyone is guilty according to someone. That is usually the case after a murder." Miss Marple resumed knitting. The rhythm of the needles often helped organize her thoughts. Suddenly she stopped. Something had occurred to her, a small detail, one of those insignificant observations that often proved important. She set the knitting aside. "Raymond." "Yes? How many clues were found?" "7. And how many suspects?" "At least 4. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Exactly. What does that mean?" "Perhaps nothing." But she knew it meant something. The clues were not merely strange, they were carefully distributed. Each seemed designed to point toward a different possibility. The tea suggested Clara. The chess piece suggested Peter Lang. The financial dispute suggested Briggs. The timing of the watch suggested another mystery entirely. Every clue encouraged investigators to look in a different direction. No genuine crime scene behaved that way. A real crime produced confusion naturally. This confusion had been manufactured. By noon, she decided to revisit Whitmore's house. Inspector Stone granted permission. He had learned that denying Miss Marple access usually accomplished very little. The study remained largely unchanged. Sunlight illuminated the bookshelves and desk. The atmosphere felt less frightening now, but the mystery remained. Miss Marple walked slowly around the room. This time she ignored the famous clues. Instead, she examined ordinary things. The desk drawers, the shelves, the papers. People focused on unusual objects after a murder. Miss Marple preferred ordinary ones. Ordinary things often revealed extraordinary truths. She paused before a cabinet containing Whitmore's collection of watches. Dozens of beautiful timepieces rested inside glass cases. Some were worth fortunes, yet none had been stolen. Interesting. Nearby stood a workbench. Tools remained neatly arranged. Again, nothing appeared disturbed. The murderer had not searched for anything, nor had he taken anything, which suggested the motive was personal. As she examined the room, her attention fell upon a small bookshelf in the corner. Several notebooks rested there. Business records, appointment books, personal journals. Inspector Stone had already reviewed them. Nevertheless, Miss Marple began reading. For nearly an hour she turned pages. Most entries were unremarkable. Meetings, deliveries, appointments. Then she found something curious. An appointment book from the current year. She flipped to the week of the murder. Most entries were written clearly, but one line immediately caught her eye. The entry for the night Edgar Whitmore died. 9 p.m. meeting with T.R. Miss Marple stared at the initials. T.R. The letters seemed simple enough, yet she felt a sudden spark of interest. Who in Ashcombe possessed those initials? Only one obvious answer came to mind. Thomas Reed, the Reverend. She carefully closed the book. Now that was interesting. Very interesting indeed. Inspector Stone arrived shortly afterward. "What have you found?" Miss Marple showed him the appointment entry. The inspector frowned. "Meeting with T.R. Yes. You think it means Reverend Reed?" "I don't know. But it's possible." Stone nodded slowly. "We'll speak to him. Please do." For the first time since the investigation began, they possessed something resembling a genuine lead. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to conduct a little research of her own. Ashcombe's residents were remarkably willing to talk, especially when approached politely. At the village post office, she learned that Edgar Whitmore and Reverend Reed had known each other for many years. At the bakery, she discovered they had once served together on several charitable committees. Near the church, she encountered an elderly resident named Mrs. Bartlett. The woman possessed a memory stretching back decades. They were close friends once, Mrs. Bartlett explained. Whitmore and the Reverend? Oh yes. What happened? Mrs. Bartlett lowered her voice. Nobody knows exactly. When? Years ago. Did they quarrel? I believe so. Miss Marple became more interested. About what? Mrs. Bartlett shrugged. Money, perhaps. There was some disagreement involving a charity fund. A charity fund? Miss Marple thanked her and continued walking. Now several pieces were beginning to fit together. Not enough for certainty, but enough for suspicion. That evening, Inspector Stone returned. His expression revealed immediate disappointment. The Reverend admits meeting Whitmore. He does? Yes. What explanation did he provide? Stone sat down heavily. He says they discussed church repairs. Raymond looked skeptical. At 9 o'clock at night? Exactly. Miss Marple remained silent. Anything else? She asked. The inspector hesitated. Reed claims he left around 9:30. And then? He returned home. Witnesses? None. For a moment nobody spoke. At last Raymond said what all three were thinking. That's not much of an alibi. No, agreed Stone. It isn't. The inspector rubbed his forehead. Yet I still can't connect him to the clues. That was the problem. Even if Reverend Reed had opportunity, the clues remained unexplained. The watch, the umbrella, the music sheet, the feather, the chess piece, the painting, the tea, 7 separate mysteries, 7 distractions. Then suddenly Miss Marple smiled. A very small smile, the kind Raymond had learned to fear. You've thought of something, he said. Perhaps. What? Miss Marple looked toward the fire. I keep asking the wrong question. What question? Why those clues were left behind. And that's wrong? Yes. She folded her hands. The correct question is why those particular clues were chosen. Raymond frowned. I don't understand. The clues are not random, she spoke slowly. Each one points toward a different person. The realization hung in the room. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Inspector Stone sat upright. Good Lord. Exactly. The tea points toward Clara. The chess piece toward Peter Lang. The business dispute toward Briggs. And the others suggest additional possibilities. Miss Marple nodded. The murderer wasn't creating clues. She paused. He was creating suspects. Silence filled the room. At that moment everything changed. The clues were no longer mysterious objects. They were weapons. Carefully constructed weapons designed to scatter suspicion in every direction. And the person who created them had made one crucial mistake. In trying to point toward everyone, he had accidentally revealed himself as someone who knew every suspect well, someone familiar with the entire village, someone intelligent enough to build a false trail, someone who had a secret worth killing to protect. For the first time, Miss Marple believed she could see the outline of the truth hidden behind the deception. The murderer was close, very close indeed. Chapter 6. The Secret of the Clockmaker. The next morning, Miss Marple awoke earlier than usual. A thin mist hung over Ashcombe, covering the village in a pale grey veil. The world seemed unusually quiet, as though nature itself were waiting for something. Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window with a cup of tea. The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fit together. Not all of them, but enough. The 7 clues no longer confused her. The appointment book no longer seemed mysterious. And Reverend Thomas Reed no longer appeared to be merely a worried clergyman. Somewhere in the years before Edgar Whitmore's death lay the answer. The question was where. After breakfast, she walked to the village library. It occupied a small stone building near the church and contained records dating back decades. The librarian, Mrs. Ellis, greeted her warmly. Researching the murder, Miss Marple? I am merely looking into local history. Mrs. Ellis smiled knowingly. Within minutes, old newspapers and parish records were spread across a table. Miss Marple began reading. Hours passed. Most articles proved unimportant. Village fetes, church fundraisers, local elections. Then she found something. A newspaper dated nearly 20 years earlier. The headline concerned a large charity fund established to renovate the village school and support poor families. The committee responsible included several prominent names. Among them were Edgar Whitmore and Thomas Reed. Miss Marple continued reading. The project had collected a considerable amount of money, yet several months later the fund had been quietly dissolved. No explanation appeared in the article. Interesting. Very interesting. She requested additional records. The librarian returned with old committee documents. Most were routine. One document, however, caught her attention immediately. Several financial pages were missing. Not lost. Removed. Deliberately. Miss Marple closed the folder. She had seen enough. By afternoon she visited Inspector Stone. The inspector listened carefully as she explained her findings. "You think Whitmore discovered something?" "I do. After 20 years, secrets do not become harmless simply because they are old." Stone nodded thoughtfully. "What sort of secret?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I believe money disappeared from that charity fund." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "And Whitmore discovered who took it." "Precisely." "Reed?" "I suspect so." For several moments the room remained silent. Then Stone opened a drawer. "There may be something else." He removed a document. "We received laboratory results this morning." Miss Marple examined the report. "What is it?" "Trace evidence from the murder weapon. The bronze clock. The object used to kill Edgar Whitmore." Stone pointed toward a line in the report. "Investigators found tiny particles of candle wax on the handle." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Candle wax?" "Yes." "From where?" "We don't know." But Miss Marple suddenly had an idea. An hour later, she stood inside Ashcombe Church. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows. The building was empty. Quiet. Peaceful. She approached the altar. Several candles stood nearby. Carefully she examined them. Then she smiled. A very small smile. The wax possessed an unusual pale color, mixed with tiny gold flecks. Distinctive, memorable, and remarkably similar to the description in the laboratory report. A coincidence? Perhaps. But Miss Marple had never trusted coincidences, not in murder investigations. That evening she shared her conclusions with Inspector Stone. "The Reverend handles church candles every day. Yes, the wax could have transferred onto his hands, and from there onto the clock." Stone nodded slowly. "That would place him at the crime scene." "Exactly." For the first time, the inspector appeared convinced. Yet one question remained. How had the murder occurred? And why create the 7 clues? Miss Marple spent the evening organizing her thoughts. By midnight, she understood everything. The following morning, she requested that Inspector Stone gather all principal suspects at Meadowcroft. The inspector agreed. By late afternoon, the drawing room was full. Clara Whitmore sat nervously beside Oliver Briggs. Peter Lang occupied a chair near the fireplace. Dr. Hale stood near the window. Reverend Reed appeared calm but pale. Inspector Stone waited quietly. Raymond watched with excitement. Miss Marple stood near the center of the room. The time had come. She began softly. "Edgar Whitmore was not killed because of money, inheritance, or business." Everyone listened. "He was killed because he discovered a secret." The Reverend shifted slightly, a tiny movement. Yet Miss Marple noticed. "Many years ago," she continued, "a charity fund disappeared. No one spoke. The theft was never exposed." Her gaze settled upon Reverend Reed. But recently, Edgar Whitmore learned the truth. The clergyman's face lost color. He arranged a meeting on the night of his death. Miss Marple picked up the appointment book. At 9 o'clock, she opened the page. Meeting with TR. Silence. He intended to confront the guilty person. The Reverend stared at the floor. During that meeting, an argument occurred. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Whitmore threatened exposure. The room seemed frozen. In panic, the murderer struck him with the bronze clock. Still nobody spoke. Then she turned toward the 7 clues. The murderer knew suspicion would immediately fall upon him. She paused. So he created confusion. One by one she explained. The stopped watch was intended to confuse the time of death. The wet umbrella suggested a mysterious visitor. The burned music sheet pointed toward a musician. The white feather suggested a bird owner. The missing chess knight pointed toward Peter Lang. Peter looked astonished. The sleeping medicine pointed toward Clara Whitmore. Clara gasped softly. And the upside-down painting existed for only one purpose, to make investigators believe there was another hidden mystery. Inspector Stone nodded. Everything finally made sense. "The clues were never evidence," Miss Marple said quietly. "They were distractions." She looked directly at Reverend Reed, and only one person knew enough about every suspect to create those distractions. The Reverend closed his eyes. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Inspector Stone stepped forward. "Thomas Reed," he said quietly, "I must ask you to come with me." The clergyman slowly opened his eyes. Years of guilt seemed visible upon his face. His shoulders sagged, and suddenly he looked like a very old man. "I never meant to kill him," he whispered. The confession echoed through the silent room. Clara covered her mouth. Raymond stared in shock. The mystery was over. The secret of the clockmaker had finally been revealed. But for Miss Marple, the case proved something she had always known. No deception, however elaborate, could completely hide the truth. Because sooner or later, human nature always betrayed itself. And in Ashcombe, it finally had. Chapter 7. The Final Revelation. For the first time in over a week, Ashcombe slept peacefully. The arrest of Reverend Thomas Reed had ended the fear that had settled over the village since Edgar Whitmore's murder. Doors were no longer locked quite so carefully. Conversations returned to ordinary matters. Children played in the village green, without anxious parents watching from nearby windows. Yet the shadow of the tragedy remained. The Reverend had been one of the most respected men in the village. His fall shocked everyone. 2 days after the arrest, Miss Marple sat in the garden at Meadowcroft, enjoying the warm afternoon sunshine. The roses swayed gently in the breeze. Across from her, Raymond stared at a notebook. "I still can't believe it." "What can't you believe?" "That it was Reed." Miss Marple smiled. "Most people find it difficult to suspect someone they admire. He seemed so kind." "He probably was." Raymond looked puzzled. "You mean that, certainly. But he was a murderer. Human beings are rarely one thing, Raymond. Good people sometimes commit terrible acts. Terrible people occasionally perform acts of kindness." She resumed knitting. The world would be much simpler if everyone fitted neatly into categories. Raymond sighed. "You always make things sound complicated." "They are complicated." Before he could reply, Inspector Stone appeared through the garden gate. His expression was far more relaxed than usual. "Good afternoon, Inspector," said Miss Marple. "May I join you?" "Of course." Stone sat down and accepted a cup of tea. "I thought you might like to know the final details." Miss Marple nodded. "The confession?" "Yes." Raymond immediately became attentive. Inspector Stone opened a folder. "Reed has admitted everything." The garden became quiet. He confessed to stealing money from the charity fund 20 years ago. Miss Marple listened carefully. At the time, he believed he could replace the money before anyone noticed. "And then?" asked Raymond. "He couldn't." The inspector shook his head. One lie led to another. Records disappeared. Questions were avoided. Eventually, the matter was forgotten. "But Whitmore remembered," said Miss Marple. "Exactly." Stone explained that Edgar Whitmore had recently begun organizing old business papers. While doing so, he discovered documents connected to the charity fund. The figures didn't match. Money had vanished. Further investigation revealed the truth. Whitmore confronted Reed privately several times. And Reed denied it? At first, the inspector turned a page. Eventually, Whitmore informed him that he intended to reveal everything. Silence settled over the garden. The final meeting had become inevitable. On the night of the murder, Stone continued, Whitmore invited Reed to the study. Raymond leaned forward. "The meeting listed in the appointment book." "Yes." The inspector nodded. According to Reed, the conversation became heated almost immediately. Whitmore demanded a public confession. Reed begged for more time. Neither man would compromise. Then came the fatal moment. In anger and panic, Reed seized the bronze clock from the desk. The inspector paused. He struck Whitmore once, only once. A single desperate act, a moment that destroyed 2 lives. The victim died almost instantly. For several moments nobody spoke. The breeze moved softly through the garden. Somewhere nearby a bird sang. The contrast between the peaceful afternoon and the terrible events they discussed felt strangely unsettling. "What happened afterward?" asked Raymond quietly. Stone smiled grimly. "That's where things become unusual. The 7 clues, everyone knew about them. The clues had become almost as famous as the murder itself. According to Reed's confession, he realized immediately that suspicion would fall upon him. He needed time. He needed confusion. And so he began creating mysteries. And he spent nearly an hour staging the scene, said Stone. "An hour?" Raymond exclaimed. "Almost exactly." The inspector explained how Reed deliberately arranged every clue. The stopped watch was altered to suggest a false time of death. The umbrella was soaked in a rain barrel. The music sheet came from old church records. The white feather was taken from a decorative ornament. The chess-knight was removed from Whitmore's chessboard. The painting was turned upside down. The sleeping medicine was added to tea that Whitmore had never touched. Each clue had one purpose: misdirection. Quite ingenious, Stone admitted reluctantly. Too ingenious, said Miss Marple. The inspector laughed. Yes, that was the mistake. The scene became so complicated that it stopped looking natural. Instead of hiding evidence, Reed had manufactured evidence. And in doing so, he revealed the presence of an intelligent manipulator, someone who knew the victim, someone who knew the suspects, someone who knew the village, someone exactly like Thomas Reed. Raymond shook his head. I still don't understand how Aunt Jane saw through it. Stone smiled. Neither do I. Miss Marple laughed softly. It wasn't difficult. Both men stared. It certainly seemed difficult. Not really. She placed her knitting in her lap. The clues reminded me of something. What? A village fete? Raymond blinked. A fete? Yes. The inspector looked confused. Miss Marple continued. Many years ago, in St. Mary Mead, a woman attempted to organize 6 different attractions at the same event. What happened? Nobody knew where to look. Stone began laughing. Raymond groaned. You solved a murder because of a village fete? Human nature is always the same, she smiled. When people try too hard to attract attention in several directions, they reveal themselves. The inspector shook his head in amazement. I don't believe anyone else in England would make that connection. That is why Miss Marple solves crimes, said Raymond. As the afternoon passed, the conversation gradually turned to other matters. The case was finished. The mystery was solved. Life would continue. A few days later, Clara Whitmore inherited her uncle's estate. Peter Lang's reputation recovered. Oliver Briggs and Clara announced plans for their wedding. The village slowly healed. Not completely. Such wounds never vanished entirely, but time would help. Eventually the day arrived for Miss Marple to return to St. Mary Mead. Raymond accompanied her to the railway station. The train waited beside the platform. You know, Raymond said, I invited you here for a peaceful holiday. Miss Marple smiled. And I had one. A murder occurred. Only briefly. Raymond laughed. The whistle sounded. Passengers began boarding. Before entering the train, Miss Marple paused. She looked back toward the village one final time. Ashcombe appeared exactly as it had when she first arrived. Quiet, beautiful, peaceful, yet she knew what lay beneath such appearances. Every village possessed secrets. Every community hid truths behind polite smiles and pleasant conversations, and wherever human nature existed, mysteries would follow. Miss Marple stepped aboard the train. As it pulled away from the station, she settled comfortably into her seat and opened her knitting bag. Another mystery had ended. Somewhere ahead, she suspected, another one was already waiting. And Miss Marple, as always, would be ready.
If you enjoy our story, then like and subscribe our channel. Thank you.